Hello, everyone. Thank you for taking time from your busy day to join us for Canada's new Allergen Management Guidelines, What Bakeries Need to Know, for an informative webinar presented by the Baking Association of Canada. I'm Colleen Cross, editor of Baker's Journal magazine, and in this session, we'll hear from Food Allergy Canada and Université Laval Department of Food Sciences, Faculty of Agriculture and Food Sciences, on the launch of their new guidelines and related resources for the food industry. We expect this webinar will be of particular interest to businesses that label packaged food products for retail and sell directly to the consumer. And they provide a blueprint for all sorts of businesses looking to upgrade their best practices and have some details on how to look at their best practices for food allergens and labeling. Offering a bakery's perspective will be May Costravani-Fava, Quality Assurance Manager, and Joe Bonifilio, Operations Manager for Toute Sweet Cakes and Pastries Limited in Woodbridge, Ontario. We're excited to hear from our experts. But before we get started, a quick little housekeeping note. You, the audience, will be in listen-only mode. You'll see a full screen of the speakers, and you can just adjust that view using the control panels. If you have any questions, type them in at any time using the question feature to the right of your screen, should be to the right for most people, and we will address them during the Q&A session at the end of the main presentation. We expect a lot of questions, so if yours isn't answered, rest assured we'll relay your questions to our speakers and they'll be addressed. We'll have plenty of time at the end for questions. And now we'll start by hearing from Martin Barnett. Martin is Executive Director of the Baking Association of Canada. Then we'll hear from Beatrice Povolo, Director, Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs for Food Allergy Canada. We'll enjoy a presentation by our experts Samuel Godefroy and Sylvia Dominguez from Université Laval. And after the presentation, Joe and May from Toute Sweet Cakes and Pastries will share their thoughts on the guidelines, and of course we'll take questions from the audience. So today's webinar will be made available to all registrants 24 hours after we complete the webinar. So no worries if you get called away, watch for that in your inbox. And now I'd like you to meet Martin Barnett. Martin is Executive Director of the Baking Association of Canada. They're presenting this wonderful webinar. He's an accomplished baker himself with wide experience since 1977, including running medium-sized wholesale and retail bakeries in Victoria, working for the Fairmount Empress Hotel, teaching at Vancouver Island University for many years, and launching a small artisan baking and training business called Seraphina's Oven in Ladysmith, BC. Hello, Martin. Can you tell our viewers a little bit about what the BAC does and why it's important to be part of the association?
Thanks, Colleen. Good morning, everybody. The Baking Association of Canada is the only association for all of the baking industry in Canada. It includes not just bakers, but pastry chefs, chocolatiers, pâtissiers, those allied to the industry, suppliers, and service providers. And we would like to welcome any new members. Please go to our website, baking.ca, if you need some more information. But I would very much like to welcome everybody to this really important webinar on new allergen management guidelines. Baking Association is very involved with advocating on regulatory affairs, so this is very appropriate. We'd like to thank all of our panelists for generously sharing their knowledge and perspectives. I'm looking forward to the webinar.
As am I. Thank you, Martin. I'll now introduce Beatrice Povolo, who is the Director, Food Safety and Regulatory Affairs at Food Allergy Canada. In this capacity, she leads the organization's food safety initiatives, working with both government and industry stakeholders with a specific focus on access to accurate ingredient information in food labeling and food service. Beatrice is actively involved in international discussions related to allergen management as a member of the Health Canada delegation for the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, and she collaborates internationally with other patient organizations globally. Beatrice is currently the project management lead for the development of allergen management and precautionary allergen labeling guidelines for the Canadian food industry. Beatrice, I'll invite you to say a few words about the guideline before our presentation. Welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Colleen, and thank you, Martin. We're really excited to be here. I think I can speak on behalf of all of my colleagues today. It's a pleasure to be with this association and be able to present the work that we've been doing over the last 3 years. So what I've done is just provide you with a quick agenda of what we'll be covering today. So first part of the agenda, we'll look at the Canadian landscape in terms of food labeling, allergen management, and precautionary allergen labeling. From there, we'll turn it over to Dr. Godefroy to give us an update on what's happening internationally, as there's a lot of discussion, a lot of work being done on precautionary allergen labeling specifically. So that'll be great to hear from Dr. Godefroy on that. And then we will pass it over to Dr. Dominguez, who will walk us through the guideline development, and then pass it over to Joe and May to give us their perspective. The project itself, I'm just going to do a quick funding acknowledgement in terms of the project. So the project was initiated about 3 years ago. It's a collaborative effort between ourselves, our colleagues at Université Laval, and our industry lead was Maple Leaf Foods. In addition to that, we brought together 15 different industry partners, our colleagues at Laval, as I said, 2 prominent allergists that we work with, and from a consumer perspective, Food Allergy Canada. This particular project was born out of discussions around the need for accurate ingredient labeling and looking at challenges both to consumers as well as to manufacturers when it comes to allergen risk management and the use of precautionary labeling. As part of that, we were very fortunate to receive funding for this particular project through the Agriculture Partnerships Agri-Assurance Program, which is a federal, provincial, territorial initiative looking to create assurance programs for the safe production of food. So we're very thankful for the funding that was provided by that organization and from our industry partners. Just before I get into the food allergy landscape, as Colleen mentioned, in terms of the project itself, as I mentioned, it is a collaborative effort that has brought together all key stakeholders in the Canadian environment, and we're very happy to work with many of them and have their insights. The guidelines themselves are voluntary guidance that has been put together for industry by industry. So bringing together all the key players and working collaboratively since the end of 2019 has been a great undertaking, and we're really appreciative of the support that we've received from all of our key stakeholders. So with that, my part of the presentation is really to kind of paint a picture for everyone of what food allergy looks like currently in Canada, how many people are affected, and what some of the challenges are from the consumer perspective, and then we'll pass it over to hear from the manufacturing side. So just many of you may be aware of the extent of having individuals and Canadians live with food allergy, but just as a recap, just over 3 million Canadians have at least a food allergy, and this impacts up to 50% of households. And what we mean by that is, in addition to the people who are living with this, up to 50% of households are impacted in that they're making a purchasing decision on behalf of someone with a food allergy. So it could be through school, it could be through work, through daycares, etc. But as we look at the issue itself and the impact food allergy has, it's not just something that impacts the individual, but does have greater consequences for our communities as well. When you're diagnosed with a food allergy, or as a parent with a child with a food allergy, or if you're diagnosed yourself, the reality is that this is usually a lifelong condition, depending on the allergen that you're allergic to. And there's currently no cure when it comes to food allergy. When you're diagnosed, basically you're told to avoid your allergen. That's really the main strategy when it comes to ensuring that you're not going to have a reaction, or your child's not going to have a reaction. And what that means is people need to be vigilant on a daily basis for any food that is being consumed by themselves or their child. So what that means is understanding what's in your food, regardless of where, if you're purchasing it, if you're preparing it, if you're dining out, the main premise is you need to know what's in your food every time that you're eating. And as you can imagine, given that we eat at least 3 times a day in my household with two teenage boys, they eat like 10 times a day, but really making sure that people are aware of what's in their food so they can avoid what they're allergic to. We also know that in spite of best efforts, sometimes accidents do happen. So what that means for this community is they always need to be prepared. And preparation really means having their epinephrine auto-injector, such as an EpiPen or an Allerject, a device that would help to treat the reaction should something happen. So at the end of the day, the big key message I think that we would like everyone to understand is that having accurate ingredient information and access to complete information is really important for consumers to make a safe and informed choice. When we take a look at the regulatory framework here in Canada, again, many of you are probably well aware of this, so I won't spend too much time here, but we already know that Health Canada has passed regulations as of 2012, the enhanced labeling regulations for allergens that require very specifically that if any of the priority allergens are in a product intentionally, so as an ingredient, they must be declared in the ingredient list, and this must be done in plain, simple language. We also know that the CFIA has had linked from a labeling perspective in terms of the information that's provided. Just have a quick visual on the side where you have an ingredient list, you have a contain statement if a company is choosing to use one, and if there is a precautionary label such as may contain, it must all appear in the same visual cue so that consumers have all the information in one place in order to decide whether that's an appropriate option for them or not. So when it comes to actually the allergens being declared on the ingredient list, it's pretty straightforward. As I mentioned, Health Canada has specific regulations that have to be applied in order to ensure that your product is properly labeled. So again, an ingredient list, a contain statement if it's used, and then a may contain, so all in that purview. Where challenges come up for consumers and for manufacturers, and when we talk about precautionary allergen labeling, so may contain statements. As we know, they are voluntarily used by manufacturers. They don't have to use them, but it is an option for them if they choose to use it to communicate to consumers that there could potentially be an issue with a priority allergen that was unintentionally included in a product or may have been unintentionally cross-contaminated in a process. So we know that the direction from Health Canada is that these are only to be used they're not to be used in lieu of good manufacturing practices. They're only to be used when there is a potential for a risk for a consumer, and it must be truthful, non-ambiguous in order to be able to communicate effectively with consumers. When we take a look at the goals that Health Canada had when they put forward these recommendations, and the last update that they had on precautionary allergen labels back in 2012, they had two main goals, and this is very important as consumers and I think as industry to look at is, the goals when it comes to consumers for PAL is to be able to minimize the risk for those with food allergies so that precautionary label is seen as an effective risk communication tool. And secondly, that it would help to maximize safe food and nutritious options for consumers with food allergy. So I think it's really important to kind of go back to the original intention of the recommendations and guidance from Health Canada, especially when we take a look at those two goals and how it can impact consumers moving forward. Just to kind of give you a quick glimpse of some of the products that we have seen and that have become, that consumers find quite challenging, and some of the labeling that we've seen currently, especially when it comes to precautionary labeling. Just wanted to give you kind of a quick overview of some of the challenges. So on the left side of the screen under concerning labels, we're seeing more and more blanket statements. And what that means is under the may contain banner, we're seeing some companies use and list all priority allergens, for example. In this particular case, it was a apple pie that was listed and it had a may contain all the priority allergens. And that's concerning for consumers to see because they don't quite understand how every allergen could potentially be cross-contaminated with one product in a certain facility. And unfortunately, when they do see those types of statements, they kind of wonder kind of what's happening, what are the manufacturing practices being undertaken in that facility. We have packages that have been put out there that have on the bottom left, for example, it's got a peanut butter product, it's got a peanut-free product, and it's got a may contain tree nuts on the back. A bit confusing in terms of what exactly is in the product and what's not. And again, things that consumers are getting challenged by in terms of labeling. In other areas, we're starting to see emerging allergens, novel allergens or novel proteins that are being used in various foods that might not be expected. So for example, on the left, we have roasted crickets, which are, I guess, becoming more and more, not necessarily common, but we're seeing more in the Canadian environment where there is a may contain or a warning for individuals that have an allergy to crustaceans, for example. So there is a known potential cross-reactivity between the two. We also have a lot of plant-based proteins that are being used in high concentrations in foods. This is an example of a creamer that was out there that has pea protein. And I think for individuals that are allergic, they're not necessarily thinking that could be in a product such as this. Or for people that have peanut allergy, where there's a known cross reactivity with pea protein, for example, that could also be a risk. So we're starting to see some interesting ingredients pop up into products that weren't expected. And then on the far right, we're just looking at how far precautionary labeling is being extended into areas it was never intended. So here, for example, we've got a meat counter that has an allergen warning again for every single allergen, all priority allergens in that particular chicken, for example. On the bottom right, you see some labeling from restaurants where, again, they're bringing forward the concept of cross-contamination across the board in their facilities. And as we know, the guidance that was put forward by Health Canada was really specific to prepackaged products only, but we're starting to see those may contain labels find themselves in areas that were never really intended. And what that means for consumers, unfortunately, is that they haven't seen it as an effective communication tool as it once was. And what we want to do is make may contain meaningful again, so that when it is being used, that there is justification behind it and that people start to heed those warnings. This is something that's just come up recently, and I'm sure it's something within the industry that is being talked about. So I thought I'd put just a quick slide together just to address a concerning trend that we've seen, again, from a consumer perspective, in relation to what's happening in the US with the passing of the FASTER Act that came into effect in January. So we've had some discussions with our counterparts in the US. We've had consumers call us asking if we're going to see different trends like this here in Canada. And it's just something that thought that was important to kind of bring forward to this community as well. So as many of you may be aware, in the US, they did add sesame as their 9th priority allergen. And as you're also aware, we have had sesame on our priority allergen list since inception and have been managing quite well. And I think what's happening is with some of our US counterparts or US manufacturers that we're starting to see sesame added to products that it wasn't there before. I just put a quick headline there from one of the US outlets, just, kind of highlighting some of the news and some of the media coverage I'm sure that you've all seen on this as well. And what it's really doing is, unfortunately, if these practices are coming into play and we're seeing it happen in the US, from a consumer perspective, we don't want to see that happening here. We don't want choices to be even further limited for people with food allergy, especially to sesame. And unfortunately, this type of practice does kind of go against the intent of the FASTER Act in the US, and I think it's an unintended consequence of that particular situation. But just wanted to kind of bring that forward, that these are concerning trends that Canadian consumers are seeing. We've had people call our office asking, we're going to start to see that here. Our request is we don't want to see that happening here, but again, just something to bring forward for this community to understand how it can impact those with food allergy, especially with sesame in this case. So what happens when we start to see PAL and other things on products that potentially are not required, or these practices are happening? Is from a consumer perspective, we start to see that their confidence in food labeling unfortunately comes down. We did a consumer survey last year to kind of get a quick pulse of what's happening from a consumer perspective. And, here are some of the preliminary findings. So when it comes to confidence in overall food labeling, there's about a 2 out of 10 of our consumers that responded had a high degree of confidence in the labels today. In general, they feel that precautionary labeling can be helpful, but it is confusing. They're not quite sure why it's put on, or some manufacturers use it, some don't. And there's not really a universal understanding when it comes to the use of precautionary label. More and more of them are seeing what we call the blanket statement, so the may contain for all priority allergens, which makes them question, what practices are being put in place overall in a facility. And about 50% of consumers are still calling manufacturers to inquire about food labels. So whether it's the ingredients themselves or precautionary labeling, they're picking up the phone or going to the consumer response to get clarity. So again, this all speaks to the need for consumers to get greater clarity and increased confidence. When we look at what does this do in terms of consumer behavior, again, we're starting to see kind of that risk-benefit balancing out. For individuals that have specific food allergies where they have may contain for their allergen on many products, we are seeing them take that more risks in the sense of trying to understand why it's there, their perception of, is it in the product, isn't it in the product, and whether or not they've reacted to this product before. So we are seeing that there is greater risk-taking happening, and we don't want to see that because we don't obviously want to have a reaction or an issue for consumer safety. But we are starting to see people looking at the precautionary labeling statement and not necessarily heeding those warnings because they feel that it may not be required, or again, they don't understand why it's there in some cases and why it's not. So with that, I'm going to wrap up now and pass it over to Sylvia. But basically, with the consumer perspective, and we'll hear now from manufacturers and why this is so important from all industry stakeholders, the Allergen Management Guidelines were kind of born, as I said, as a collaborative effort to address these concerns, not only from a consumer perspective, but also from the manufacturing side. And really the focus is taking a risk-based approach when it comes to allergen management and specifically PAL. And hopefully the outcome of that and the expected outcome would be that we can increase the accuracy of labeling, and that can help consumers be more confident when they're purchasing product. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Sylvia.
Thanks a lot, Beatrice. Okay, so as Beatrice mentioned, one of the main goals, or the main goal of this project, was to produce consensus guidelines for allergen management. So the obvious first step was to understand how are manufacturers managing allergens now, what types of challenges they're facing, and we decided to collect this information through a survey. And today I'll give you a very brief overview of some of the results we obtained. The survey was opened during the summer of 2021 and is published now, open access. We published this last year, so I invite you to go through the document. You'll have all the results there. Today, I'll just present a quick overview, but we obtained 84 full responses from companies from all manufacturing sectors and with a high representation of large companies. Most of the respondents produced finished products with allergens as ingredients and in PAL, and they declared having a clearly defined allergen management approach, and the most prevalent allergens were soy and milk. Next slide, please. So as I said, we covered different aspects of allergen management in this survey, but for today's presentation, I will focus on the questions related to allergen thresholds. Allergen thresholds were used by almost half of respondents, 48%, as you see here, mostly for gluten and sulfites. However, in the bar plot, you can see other allergens for which there are no regulatory limits were also common. We asked then about the context of use. Overall thresholds were mostly used in connection with finished product testing, but this was not true when we analyzed the data broken down per company size. This was not true for large companies who seem to apply them under a preventive approach and during incident management. And note here with an arrow I marked that only 12 respondents indicating using thresholds for PAL. Next slide, please. So we decided to ask further questions on the use of thresholds for PAL. Thresholds were perceived as useful by most respondents for this function, but as we just said in the previous slide, their use was limited. So we asked about the concerns related to using thresholds for PAL. As you see in this figure, we asked respondents to rank 7 elements, from least to most concerning. So in the figure, you see most concerning is kind of in brownish and least concerning in green. And respondents were most concerned with legal and regulatory aspects and least with financial aspects. Next slide, please. Now, we asked, remember, only 12 respondents said they use thresholds for PAL. So we asked how the need for PAL is established in your company. And we found some interesting answers. The first option is good, like cross-contact allergens that cannot be avoided are declared in PAL. That's perfect. However, the two other criteria circled in red are a bit concerning. Cross-contact allergens that cannot be avoided are declared as ingredients. Listing allergens not intentionally added in the ingredients list, as you know, is against food labeling regulations. Perhaps to circumvent this legal implication, some manufacturers reported, also here circled in red, adding small quantities of allergens to avoid PAL, which is also questionable. And then other not risk-based criteria, like listing in PAL all allergens used in the facility, for example, were also noted. Next slide, please. And then finally, regarding regulatory matters, it seems like the current framework is not fully understood, as most respondents indicated that they would benefit from enhanced clarity on expectations related to current regulatory framework on food allergens and its enforcement. This was kind of a surprising finding for us. So that was a very quick overview specifically of the thresholds part of the survey. But as I mentioned, the survey is very comprehensive on allergen management in general. Overall, respondents reported having a strong allergen management awareness. We noted the absence of standardized PAL criteria. As we know, there's no standardized PAL criteria, so this was not surprising. However, there were some concerning practices noted. PAL thresholds were perceived as useful. However, legal concerns may be limiting their use. And some of the opportunities we identified is the need for allergen awareness for small and medium manufacturers, the influence of third-party quality systems. These are things that I didn't go over just now in the slides, but that came up in the survey responses. So for example, about third-party quality systems, they seem to have a very strong influence on what type of practices or controls are implemented in a facility. And also there's the possibility that would be interesting to introduce the concept of risk assessment into regulations, not necessarily thresholds, but at least the concept of risk assessment for the use of PAL. Some challenges also were identified. Handling raw materials with PAL is difficult because of a lack of information on where this PAL comes from. So then it's hard for the manufacturer to know whether to carry it forward or not. And there were some concerns related to the reliance on analytical methods to establish the level of control of allergen management practices. As we know, it's very hard to validate all methods used for all matrices and all allergens. So that's a concern. Interpretation of results is not really straightforward. There's no sampling plans, etc. So there's several issues related to analytical methods that were brought up in this survey. So it was quite interesting. And then, so that was about the manufacturers. So Beatrice also spoke about the consumer. Then the other important element here is the regulatory implications, right? So for that, we decided to look into recalls data. So we went through recall data from the CFIA collected between 2017 and 2021. And that here we wanted to know if certain allergens or certain manufacturing sectors were more challenging than others, or what other information we could get from recalls data. So in this bar plot, you can see the number of food recalls reported on the CFIA website. This is public information. And those related to undeclared allergens are in red. As you see, the trend hasn't really changed in the last 5 years. Between 34 and 39% of food recalls were related to undeclared allergens. But note that this is not necessarily a representation of non-compliances in the market, but rather of the samples that CFIA investigated. So, for example, some products or some product categories may be targeted as part of investigations or because they were new in the market or based on previous history of non-compliance, etc. But the main idea here is that we still have more than 30% allergen recalls every year, and this number seems to be a steady trend. In the next slide, you'll see we're summarizing the main characteristics of undeclared allergen recalls in Canada. In the horizontal bar plot, you can see milk is by far the allergen most frequently linked to recalls with more than 30%. However, we also analyze the data per sector. This is an overall picture, but when you look at it per sector, This may vary. For example, the undeclared allergen most often linked to recalls of meat products was egg. Regarding food categories, there was not such a clear trend. Multi-component foods, like frozen meals or pies or sandwiches, stuff like that, are linked to 14% of undeclared allergen recalls, but really in this case, it's hard to identify which component of the food was responsible. And with respect to recall classes, class 1 is the most prevalent at more than 40%. So this is a snapshot of what we found related to recalls. We can look at it more per sectors, per allergen, etc. But the main point is that allergen recalls are still very prevalent, and something has to change if we want to reduce these numbers. So with that, I will give the floor to Dr. Godefroy, who's going to talk about the international context when this work was developed. So Sam, please.
Thank you very much, Sylvia, and good morning to you all. And again, very thankful to the Baking Association of Canada for giving us the opportunity to offer this update, and also hopefully to have a dialogue subsequently. So when this initiative was started, of course, it was happening, in fact, in a context at the national level that was introduced by Beatrice. But at the international level, we know that food regulators take their cue and their direction from the international food standard setting body, and that is the Codex Alimentarius Commission. And as it happened, when we were actually starting the discussion about this work, Codex has reopened its agenda in order to incorporate new areas of work about food allergens. You may recall that we owe to Codex in 1999 the guidance on the labeling of what we consider to be priority allergens. And in fact, when you look at the major regulatory provisions around the world that pertain to the declaration of allergens on the labels, particularly now in this case, declaration of ingredients, you will note that most, if not all, these provisions are subsequent to the adoption by Codex in 1999 and under, in fact, the auspices of the Codex Committee on Food Labeling, which is hosted by Canada, the adoption of a standard that clarified the requirements of labeling of priority allergens. And to paraphrase, in fact, that standard, Codex came up with a general provision that says that when an ingredient is deemed to be a priority allergen, and in fact, criteria for what a priority allergen is were set. So when there is such priority allergen, well, that allergen has to be mandatorily labeled on prepackaged foods. And essentially, the intent is to make sure that there wouldn't be any exemptions or any type of provision that may hide the declaration of that ingredient on the label. Now, since the late 1990s, Codex did not work on allergens until basically close to 20 years later. In 2018, the file was reopened, and it was reopened mainly as a result of requests from the food manufacturing community, supported by, of course, a number of regulators, seeking more guidance on the way the food hygienic practices would apply in relation with the management of allergens. And that's why, in fact, work was conducted under the auspices of CCFH, the Codex Committee on food hygiene. And in fact, we came up with an updated guidance in that regard. But then also, the other committee that got interested in this is CCFL as well, so the Codex Committee on Food Labeling. And this time, the questions that were raised were no longer about the declaration of ingredients, but rather about the use of this rather prevalent sentence or suites of sentences that we find on food labels around the world, and that's the may contain statement and the likes. And in fact, when CCFL started re-examining this file, the committee identified that there were a number of scientific questions that needed to be addressed. And for those of you who know a little bit how Codex works, Codex is in fact the risk management body. It's basically the ultimate regulator of the world for food, if we want to represent it as such. But in order to conduct its work, it needs to rely on an advisory body, and that advisory body happens to be a joint committee of FAO and WHO, which are the parent UN organizations of Codex. And in fact, 3 key questions were posed to the risk assessors of Codex, 3 key questions in order to help CCFL continue its work. The first question was related to the list of what we call priority allergens. Basically, delegations acknowledged that that list was not revisited since the late 1990s. We gained experience in that regard, and that there needed to be an update about the criteria of adopting what we call a priority allergen. A second question was related to the fact that everybody now acknowledges that food allergic reactions are threshold-based reactions, and whether it would be possible to have a scientific advice about what these thresholds, what would be the eliciting doses that would induce an allergic reaction, and again, using the available scientific information in that regard. And a third question is in fact a corollary to the second one, and that is really to see whether there is any type of evidentiary support that would enable a better reliance or a better use of these precautionary labeling. In other words, would there be a risk-driven approach in order to consider applying a precautionary labeling or a may contain statement on the labels of prepackaged foods? Now, work actually was carried out between 2020 and 2022, and in fact 3 meetings in total of the expert body took place, and in fact the reports are already out, and we have seen in fact a number of advances in this regard. So for example, the list of priority allergens was reviewed and updated and considered in fact a number of criteria, particularly considering prevalence, considering severity, and considering potency as the main criteria that would drive the characterization of an ingredient to be a priority allergen. And the global list of priority allergen was reviewed, and this was the recommendation that was made by this body. So amongst the changes that are being recommended, for example, soy is recommended to be taken out of the priority allergen list. And on the other hand, sesame was deemed to be fulfilling most of the criteria at the global level and would be considered for addition. At the same time, this expert body identified another list that they considered to be a watch list of ingredients, simply because we are witnessing changes in food production practices, but also in dietary habits that are likely to lead to a different pattern of allergenicity. This list includes pulses. It includes also insects, which are known to contain proteins that have either similarity or even cross-reactivity with proteins that are known to be contained, for example, in crustacea, but also other foods, other fruit, for example, such as kiwi. Now, of course, this information, along with the threshold information that was also being considered, will have to be taken into account by the Codex Committee on Food Labeling in order to identify what next action will be. Now, specifically about threshold, and this is considered to be a major advancement, for thresholds, the expert body came up with a review of the scientific information, and there was a recommendation to use the eliciting dose 5, which is essentially the eliciting dose in 5% of the allergic population, to be a basis for the identification of what we call a health-based guidance value. So essentially, this would be a number that could be used in risk assessments, and you see that these reference doses were recommended for the majority of those priority allergens. And you see also that they vary between 1 milligram of total protein up to 200 milligrams of total protein when it comes to shrimp. This expert body also made a recommendation that if we are going to be using thresholds and if we're going to be using detection of proteins in commodities, we need to be very careful about the analytical methods that will be used to make such determination. And the advice that was made is that there should be minimum performance requirements for these analytical methods for them to be adopted, particularly in the context of regulatory testing. The next slide, please. Beatrice. And the third item, the third question related to that scientific or evidentiary base that would support the reliance on precautionary labeling on the basis of risk. You will note that, in fact, the group came up with sort of a decision tree, again, that is based on a small risk assessment, very much similar to what you're going to be hearing later on through the through the guidelines that that we came up with. It's actually along the same lines. If the value of what is identified in terms of exposure is higher than a particular level that is based on that reference dose, then in this case, there is a recommendation to move ahead with the possibility of precautionary allergen labeling. So essentially, to base that decision of putting an allergen precautionary labeling on the label or not on the basis of a risk assessment that could use or that could take into account the determination of the presence of that unintended allergen and a determination of exposure, and comparing that with the reference value that essentially was agreed upon by the expert body. Now, of course, the next steps will be how the outputs of the scientific advice will be taken into consideration by Codex, and there is an upcoming meeting, in fact, in a couple of months, so in May, that's going to be held, in fact, in Canada, and we will see how Codex and how CCFL will take on that advice and actually transform it into perhaps new work, and that's what we hope, new work around an improved guidance to be provided on a risk-based approach for precautionary labeling. So that's in summary what Codex came up with, and this is the slide that already I mentioned. So this file is likely to be active in Codex for a number of years, and it was actually I'm not going to say fortuitous, but it was a good set of circumstances that our work and the development of the guidelines that we have embarked on was happening at the same time as this international work. It allowed us also to take into account the latest findings of the expert body under the auspices of FAO and WHO.
Great, thank you so much, Samuel. That was an excellent overview of the international perspective. With that now, we will ask Dr. Dominguez Silvia to take over from here and walk us through the guidelines themselves in terms of the specifics. Silvia?
Yes, so by now you probably want to know about the guidelines. So that's what I'm going to present from now on. This is a very thorough document, so this is going to be an overview, but we'll try to go through the main steps, the most important ones for you during this webinar. So next slide, please, Beatrice. First, let me tell you about how we approach this project. It's a big project. It's not a new subject. So as you know, there are several guidance documents on allergen management out there from different organizations, different countries, different authorities. So the first thing we did was actually collect this information, analyze it systematically to see what's been done, where are there gaps, where we would need to generate new data. So we didn't at this point reinvent the wheel, right? We started from some base, some foundation. Then we held several brainstorming sessions with the stakeholders participating in our project, where we identified what is of interest for Canadian manufacturers, what is of interest for the international community, how do we want to present our guidelines, etc. So we came up with a general outline for our work. We also generated new data. As you heard Beatrice talked about the consumer survey. We also presented just now the manufacturer survey. So we wanted to have a better idea of the issues or the concerns of Canadian manufacturers and consumers. So we did that through surveys. And then with all that information, we started writing. So we created a drafting committee with about 5 of our stakeholders and us at Laval and Food Allergy Canada. And we started writing, and there were a lot of back and forth revisions, comment cycles, etc. And finally, we came up with a version that we considered our first version that covered all the items we wanted to cover. And we presented this to the whole stakeholder group for validation. There were another couple of review cycles. It was also reviewed by international partners, the part specifically about the quantitative assessment. And it was also reviewed by the allergists participating in the project. And we came up after all this work with what you'll see now, or what you've seen probably online, that first version of the Canadian Allergen Management Guidelines, where we present best practices that are internationally recognized, that have the input of our Canadian manufacturers. And also what is new that hadn't been done before is we present a structured risk assessment approach to guide PAL decisions and ultimately better meet the needs of allergic consumers. So this is the table of contents of the document. As you can see, it covers introductory sections on food allergy and regulatory requirements. And then we focus, of course, on allergen management. This is the core of the document. It basically describes in detail how to develop an allergen control plan. As you probably know, an allergen control plan outlines a facility strategy to prevent introducing unintended allergens to a product, and also outlines how specific measures are to be implemented, monitored, and evaluated. So each of the elements in this process map on the right are developed in the document. The first 4, so from A through D, hazard identification and the identification, implementation, and evaluation of control measures, are really no different in principle from what you know already in the context of preventive control plans or hazard plans. The added value is that we present them as an enhanced and more thorough version targeting allergens. And again, that we have incorporated the most recent recommendations internationally and from the Canadian manufacturers' experience. The last element, letter E, communicate risks, this is where we go beyond what's currently available in other guidance documents. And this will be the focus of the presentation, but first let's look briefly at the preceding elements. So the first one, we really cannot jump to letter E without going through the very foundational element, which is hazard identification. When developing an allergen control plan, this is the most fundamental step, is to identify the allergen hazards of concern. If they are correctly identified, then adequate control measures will follow, as well as accurate allergen declaration. So again, this step is similar to the hazard identification conducted for other PCPs, except that it goes in a lot more detail, and especially that we include the identification of unintended allergens potentially introduced at different steps of the production chain. So not only the allergens intentionally added as ingredients. Identifying all allergens hazards really is not as easy as it may sound. It requires a team formed by employees from different departments. It includes analyzing any possible point of entry for allergens from raw materials, processing steps, employees, etc. And next, this kind of paper exercise should be validated through an allergen mapping process. So walking the lines and also checking for any other potential hazards. In the guidelines, we provide recommendations in detail on how to conduct a thorough allergen hazard identification, but In the end, the final products of this step would be a master list of all allergens that enter the facility. And then for each finished product, the identification of all allergens that are directly added through raw materials, indirectly added as unintentional components of raw materials, and unintentionally introduced during the different processing steps. The next 3 steps focus on the control measures, their identification, implementation, and evaluation. So during hazard ID, of course, we identify the allergen hazards. The goal of the next step is to have a better understanding of what the control measures need to target to address these identified hazards. So to do this, we need to consider in an integrated fashion the amount of allergen protein, the allergen's physical form, the characteristics of the cross-contact event, cross-contact allergen distribution in the food, etc. So there are several things to consider. The next step is selecting and implementing the control measures. So first, we had a general idea of what we needed to target. Now we're going to define exactly what's going to be my control measure in my operation. This is, of course, specific, very specific to the facility, to the product, the process. In the guidelines, we provide extensive information on allergen control measures. We focus on, we've broken them down on 13 elements. So human resources, supply chain, product development, raw materials, etc. I'm not listing the 13 here in the slide. But then each manufacturer should adapt these general recommendations to their specific operations and risks. And then the entire ACP, the allergen control plan, should be reviewed to check if it continues to be effective. And this should be done at a pre-established frequency, for example, once per year, but also when there are changes that may affect allergen control. And this evaluation should include not only like reviewing the plan on paper, but it should include direct observation of practices. It should include an assessment of the control level achieved with the measures in place, also a review of records and an analysis of trends. So those were probably the steps I assume you're familiar with from the context of operating with the PCPs. Let's focus now on the risk communication step, the last one in our guidance document. So the process flow you see here is the continuation from the one I showed earlier, listing all the allergen control plan steps, but it has been expanded to show the steps involved in the risk communication part. So as we all know, allergens added as ingredients must be declared on the product's label. There's no question about here. These allergens were identified during the hazard identification steps. The next step is assessing the need for PAL. So the premise of our approach to do this is that PAL must only be used to communicate the unintentional, unavoidable presence of allergens present at the level that poses a risk to food allergic consumers as determined by a risk assessment. This is, I highlighted in red because this is one of the highlights of our document. You've all heard a lot of a risk-based approach, but here what we did was include a step-by-step way of doing it, right? Now we have more clear guidance on how to do this. In general, we propose first that this risk assessment should be first qualitative, so not based on data or thresholds or numbers, but following an analysis of the type of a weight of evidence approach. And only if this assessment is inconclusive, then a quantitative one would be required. And in this case, yes, we rely on comparison to reference doses, but we'll see that on the next slides. So first, I mentioned we would start with a qualitative assessment. This is basically a review of the process based on objective evidence of when control measures may pass or fail. So the key word here is objective evidence. This is something manufacturers most likely already have. This may include, for example, validation studies, recognized cleaning standards, training records, etc. We need to consider, however, that some factors can have a stronger or a more direct effect on occurrence of cross-contact allergens than others, and this can be incorporated in a weight of evidence approach. Also, it's important to notice that this type of assessment is subjective. So it could be influenced by the experience of the assessors. So it's very important to consider, again, a multidisciplinary team that thoroughly knows the operation. So as you see in the process map, once you have gathered and assessed your evidence, the qualitative assessment could conclude that there is sufficient supporting evidence that control measures can prevent the occurrence of unintended allergens. So in this case, we can already reach a decision. We can already say we have evidence, we don't need PAL. The opposite could be true also, that the evidence shows that control measures cannot prevent the occurrence of unintended allergens. And in this case, again, we can reach a decision that PAL is necessary. It may also happen that there's insufficient supporting evidence of the measures or the efficacy or the inefficacy of the measures. So in this case, we recommend going to a quantitative assessment before reaching PAL decisions. So let's see with a couple of examples how this could be done. In this example, we have a small baker that produces a cookie that we call cookie A that contains milk in the recipe before cookie B that does not contain milk. So the risk assessment question here is, do we need PAL for milk in cookie B, the one that is produced after? So to reach this decision, the first step is to gather objective evidence, as we mentioned. Can you press click, please, Beatrice? Yeah, well, that's it. So we'll go step by step. We do it systematically. First, we look into raw materials. Here, the ingredient that contains milk is skim milk powder that is added as an ingredient to cookie A. Here, receiving procedures are in place, personnel are trained. So milk is very easily identified in this ingredient, of course, and the facility knows how to handle and store the allergen. So cross contact here really is unlikely. There's very weak evidence that will for this step. The next step, design of premises and equipment, we look at if there is any problem with the cleaning or if there are spaces that could accumulate allergen, etc. In this case, this is not an issue. Equipment is recent and allows for proper cleaning. So equipment design does not hinder cleaning, but it does not prevent cross contact directly either. But in any case, this is weak evidence for our assessment. Production, you may have said, okay, why don't we just change scheduling and that's it? We don't have to run B after A. But for the sake of our example, we'll just say that scheduling cannot be changed. Presence of milk in the cookie A is addressed in changeover procedures. So the facilities management is aware that there's an allergen here and we need to be careful. So changeover procedures do address this. Training of personnel that participate in changeover is adequate and is conducted at the required frequency. So the evidence shows that the possibility of cross contact is addressed in changeover procedures. There's a proactive approach, right, to control this, but it does not ensure the absence of cross contact. So here we're in a medium weight evidence. Now we reach cleaning. Cleaning consistently meets a visually clean standard. There's also a validation study that analytically demonstrated that milk proteins are not detected in B when cleaning is conducted after production of A and following the standard operating procedures. The validation study also is robust and is recent. And the facility also verifies cleaning according to SOPs, specifically targeting milk detection on surfaces. So here we have very strong evidence that cleaning assures no visible residue, and also we have analytical tests that report undetectable milk proteins in B. So in conclusion, with this evidence, we can say that control measures can consistently prevent the occurrence of milk in cookie B when it's produced as established after a cookie A, and therefore we can make the decision that PAL for milk in this situation is not required. Now we have another example also for the qualitative approach. In this one, we're talking about bagels. We have again the example of a baker that produces sesame bagels every day. That's their top seller, we're going to say. But they're concerned because they find sesame seeds sometimes in certain equipment or in production areas on the floor. So they need to know if some or all of their finished products would require PAL for sesame under this context. So for this, they gather also evidence, and we go step by step like before. There is sesame, of course, or sesame seeds. They're very easily identified as allergens. They come from an approved supplier, and they're adequately identified at receiving, and they're well stored, sealed, segregated, etc. So we're going to say cross contact at this step is very unlikely. Regarding design of premises and equipment, there we have some problems. Ingredients are staged in an area that is not physically separated from production. There are also old ovens. They cannot be fully accessed during cleaning. Replacement, for the sake of our example, we're going to say replacement or modifications are not possible at the moment. So we have strong evidence here that the design of premises and equipment does not allow for adequate physical segregation and also may hinder cleaning. This is something that they cannot control. Production also seems a bit problematic. Sesame bagels are processed every day. During the first run, they're sold early in the morning, we'll say. And this happens along at the same time as products that do not contain sesame are being produced. Staging employees are adequately trained. Sesame seeds are adequately handled. However, they are sometimes found in scales and on the floor of the staging area. Bagels also are sprinkled with sesame seeds on the trays in which they're baked, and sesame seeds again are found on the production floor. And it's not possible to have only one oven dedicated to sesame bagels for this operation. So this evidence shows that cross contact is likely and cannot be consistently prevented with the control measures in place. Then cleaning, in this case, cleaning, well, the facility, of course, is cleaned every day at the end of production. Staging and production areas do meet visibly clean standards, but sesame seeds are sometimes found in these areas at the start of the next day's production. As we said before, oven cleaning is not fully achieved. They cannot always meet the visually clean standard. And again, they find sesame seeds sometimes around the floor. No, in oven areas, sorry. So since visibly clean standards cannot be consistently met, and they do find sesame seeds around the facility, this is an allergen that is likely to spread and it's difficult to remove from the environment, at least in this particular facility. We're going to have to say that we have very strong evidence that the control measures cannot consistently prevent unintended sesame, and therefore the facility decides to use PAL for all the products they make. Next slide, please. So those were examples of decisions you can reach with qualitative assessments. As you see, we didn't use any numbers, any thresholds, but we have a systematic approach. Now, some cases this may not provide enough evidence, and only in these cases we would need to do a quantitative assessment where we will need numerical data. So because here, allergen protein exposure dose from consumption of a food is compared to an allergen protein dose predicted or estimated not to trigger a reaction in most of the allergic population. So the thresholds we were mentioning before based on eliciting doses. And we will do this considering worst case scenarios to keep a conservative perspective. So let's see also with an example how we can do this. In this example, we're going to say this is a manufacturer that produces chips that contain as an ingredient a seasoning mix that carries PAL for soy. So this is a raw material that has PAL. The chips manufacturer conducts a qualitative assessment, but it was inconclusive precisely because they don't know where this PAL is coming from in this raw material. So they decided to collect more information and potentially do this quantitative assessment. To know what is their question? They want to know if they need to carry forward the PAL from the seasoning mix into the chips. So let's start with the reference dose. As you know, in Canada, there are no regulatory requirements for the use of PAL based on reference doses or thresholds, but these values can be found in the literature. For example, from the FAO/WHO or from the Vital program in Australia or from scientific publications. So in this case, the manufacturer decides to use the reference dose of 0.5 milligrams of soy proteins that are estimated by a Vital program to protect 99% of soy allergic individuals. Now, we also mentioned we need to know the amount of food consumed. Here, we need to know what is a reasonable maximum amount a person could consume in one eating occasion. This is because allergic reactions occur shortly after consumption of the food. So we need to know in one sitting what's the max you could eat. In this example, since chips are food likely to be consumed in one single eating occasion, right? You open a pack of chips, you finish it. The manufacturer decides to use the data from the Canadian Community Health Survey. This is nutritional data that have food consumption of a huge variety of foods. And we can look, for this case, into the category savory snacks. They report average daily intakes for people that consume savory snacks, which was 42.5 grams. And they also report 50% percentile and 90% percentile. The 90th percentile was 90 grams or less. And the serving size on the chips label is 28 grams. So based on this information, the manufacturer decides that 2 bags of chips, so 56 grams, will represent a reasonable worst case eating occasion. Now, in the next slide, we'll look into, so we have a reference dose, we have the amount consumed. We need to know the concentration of allergen in the food, in the chips. And we'll do this without testing finished product. Instead, we'll use worst case estimates from previous steps. So we said the spice mix that had the PAL for soy only indicated may contain soy, no more information. So the manufacturer has to contact the supplier to obtain additional information if they want to be able to do a thorough assessment. So they find out that the cross-contact soy comes from the supplier's facilities because they use soy flour in other ingredients, in other spice mixes, and that the contamination is sporadic, it's not systematically, it's not always there. They have tested some samples and sometimes they find, sometimes they don't. They really cannot control it, that's why they have PAL. The levels also found varied greatly. The maximum level of soy flour they detected in the spice mix is 15 ppm, part per million. They only tested a limited number of samples, but this is the information they share. So the manufacturer knows this information is not fully representative, but it is sufficient actually to develop a worst case scenario. So they assume that all lots of this spice mix are contaminated at the level of 15 ppm of soy flour. However, note that this is soy flour and we need to express our results as soy protein because this is how the reference doses are expressed and we're going to compare. So the maximum concentration of soy protein is obtained by multiplying 15 by 0.4. This is a percentage of protein that you can obtain from the literature. And this gives 16 milligrams of soy protein per kilo of spice mix. Then we also know that the chips recipe, it contains 12% of this spice mix, and they introduce it during a mixing step, so everything is supposed to be homogeneously distributed. And note there is a baking step, right, to make chips, and this results in a 6% total weight loss per product specification sheet. So we can now estimate the concentration of soy proteins in the chips considering a 100-kilo batch, for example. So we have that the amount of spice mix added would be 12 kilos, that there's 6 milligrams of soy protein in 1 kilo. So in 12, there will be 72 milligrams. And with the water loss, the total weight of our batch would be 94 kilos. So we can compute a concentration of soy protein in the finished products, the chips, in a worst case scenario. That would be equal to 72 divided by 94, and this gives us 0.77 milligrams of soy protein per kilo of chips. So in the next slide, we'll do a recap of all this information. So we're using 0.5 milligram as a reference dose. The soy protein concentration in the chips we just saw was 0.77 milligrams per kilo, and the maximum amount consumed in one eating occasion we said was 56 grams, so 0.056 kilos of chips. Notice that we're being very careful with the units. So therefore, if we have 0.77 milligrams of soy protein in 1 kilo of chips, how much would we have in this amount that represents the one eating occasion of the 0.056 kilos? So there will be 0.043 milligrams. And this is our exposure dose, or the worst case amount of soy protein a consumer would consume in one eating occasion. And this is what we compare to the reference dose. So it's smaller than the reference dose of 0.5. So the manufacturer feels confident not using PAL for soy. I hope I didn't overwhelm you with all these numbers. But now let's go back to our key recommendations. So first, we finished with all these computations, but remember, robust allergen management implies, first of all, allergen hazard identification, thorough allergen hazard identification. It should include unintended allergens. And it relies also on risk-based control measures that should be based on recognized best practices. And all of this should already give us confidence on accurate allergen declaration. Now, the use of PAL should be based on risk assessment. This is in agreement with international guidance. However, this doesn't mean you have to go through a quantitative assessment for every single item. First, you have a robust allergen program. You understand the control measures efficacy. Then you can do a qualitative assessment that, as we saw, is based on information you most likely already have as a manufacturer. And only in the end, if needed, you will go through a quantitative step. So this already gives you a standardized process to demonstrate how you reach your PAL decisions. And we think this will be meaningful for manufacturers and for consumers. And as action, well, we hope the guidelines will be used as a resource to develop allergen control plans for manufacturers that may not have one, to review their plans, to enhance their plans, and hopefully consult as an ongoing resource. And with that, I'll give the floor back to Beatrice to talk about the resources process.
Great, thank you so much, Sylvia. There will be a quiz at the end. No, just kidding. Thank you so much for going through that. I know there's a lot of detail there, and we really appreciate you walking it through step by step. And again, if there's any questions on any of those processes, we'll be happy to take them shortly. So the culmination of all the work that we've just discussed, of all the work that Sylvia and team has done, of all the surveys and all of the various work that we've done has culminated in a number of resources that are available to everyone in both official languages of English and French, as well as at no cost to the user. So we're very happy to be able to provide all of these resources, which include a summary of guidance and practices. As Sylvia mentioned in the beginning, we looked at all of the different practices internationally when it came to allergen management, and she's put together a great summary for anyone who's looking for additional resources. The guidelines themselves, as well as training modules, 10 modules as part of our training program that can be downloaded and used directly from the website. We put together a user guide, which is a bit of a fast track in terms of getting to certain sections if you know exactly what you're looking for, to be able to fast track that for you. And as Sylvia mentioned, we also provided the research study, which is a culmination and an overview of the information that we received through the manufacturer's study. So all of that can be easily accessed. These are just some quick visuals. I want to get to Joe and May before we get into Q&A. So I'm just going to go a little bit quickly over these, just some examples of the resources that are there, the user guide and the self-assessment questionnaire, the course structure, so you can take a look at that, as well as the executive summary and the research, as I mentioned. It can all be downloaded here, and I believe, Colleen, you've already put this in the chat, but we'll make sure that we have that link available to everyone so they can know where to download the information as soon as we're done the webinar. And now with that, we would love to hear from Joe and from May from Toute Bakery. One of the highlights of our webinar is always getting some input from those that it was intended to help, including some of the small and medium-sized manufacturers. So we're really happy to have them here to give us their perspective. So I'll hand it over to the two of you.
Hello, everyone, and yes, thanks for having us as part of the presentation. I'm Joe. This is May. We are from Toute Sweet Cake and Pastry Limited. But I guess before we get into it, just some background information about us. So we are a commercial bakery located in Woodbridge, Ontario. We've been operating in the general area since 1987, but our bakery history ties into as far back as the 50s and 60s. Our family brought the first registered Italian bakery in Toronto. So that's pretty cool. And we take pride in that and we operate as such. But as of today, we are in a 14,000 square foot food plant operating under the SQF scheme. And what we do is frozen desserts, all kinds of cakes, round cakes, slab cakes, pound cakes, cupcakes, muffins, anything that's sweet, we have made it or currently make it. A lot of co-packing and private labeling for the retail and food service sector. Some of the guys, we have our products, I guess, ending up in our supermarkets like Longo's, Metro, Walmart, the superstores. But then our products even end up in various cafeterias, office buildings, schools, hospitals, hotels. So we have our products in a lot of different areas, and we've aligned ourselves with some notable brands and companies such as Sara Lee, Tyson Food, Riches, both U.S. and Canada, President's Choice. So we know what it takes to work with these guys, and we know that they require you to have all your programs in place. So next slide, please. So why is food allergen management important? I guess for us, first and foremost, it's the integrity of the brand. A lot of the names I mentioned in the previous slide, such as like the Tyson Foods, the Sara Lee's, the Walmarts, these kind of guys, they tend to, want to align themselves with organizations that have their programs in place. So it's important to make sure that, you are efficient in what you do and you have all your ducks in order, because it kind of opens up more doors for you in the long run. So you kind of have a better chance to bid on certain situations, certain products. Obviously, it's important for to establish a relationship with the end user, right? The customer, because like was stated earlier in this presentation, a lot of these individuals who have to kind of keep an eye on the labels and see what's in their food, they tend to kind of want to have trust with the brand. And if they've had your product before and have had zero issues, you kind of have like a loyalty with them. And I feel like that's very important, and you don't want to let them down ultimately. The food allergen program kind of aligns itself with all the other programs that, as a food manufacturer, we kind of have to follow. So I'm a believer that if you're diligent and efficient in your other food programs, the food allergen side of things should be equally as important and be equally as efficient. And I would say the most important thing is to avoid that R word, recalls. Thankfully, I don't really necessarily know what one of those look like other than the mock recalls we do. But, I feel it's if you align yourself properly and you follow, the protocols, you should be able to hopefully avoid having to do any sort of recalls, because I know it's probably very costly in the long run. The next slide. So now I'll kind of turn it over to May, who will discuss our actual internal program.
Hello, everybody. So we have just a glance of our allergen management program. In Toute Sweet, we produce over 35 SKUs products, and this includes cakes, muffins, and layers. So the allergens we deal with are wheat, egg, milk, soy, and sulfites. It should be mentioned that our facility is a nut-free plant, and here we do not use precautionary allergen labeling, and all our labels declare contains. Since we are a nut-free plant, allergen challenges still arise for products which have different combinations of allergens, as well as two types of products, eggless cakes and non-dairy and egg-free cake. We have an allergen management program in which the allergen hazards have been identified through hazard risk assessment and control measures and operation activities such as employees training, supplier approval program, purchasing, R&D, and receiving and storage, process steps, maintenance, label, and cleaning, all have been implemented. And actually, we evaluate our allergen management program through hazard validation, internal and external audit. For our allergen-free claim labels, we also consider several activities to ensure that there is no cross-contamination, such as we specified production days for those, allocated specific essential, dedicated personnel, controlling traffic flow, and routine allergen testing. Now I ask Joe to continue about some challenges of the small business.
Joe again. So when I'm asked, like, what are some of the challenges as a small business? One of the first things always come to my head is sometimes the rules and procedures are a little overwhelming, in the sense that I feel that a lot of these scenarios are applicable to like larger businesses. And I find it difficult as a smaller business to have to follow the same scenarios, because it's both on the cost side and the logistical side. It could be, like I said, overwhelming. So that's always one of the first challenges, is trying to, I guess, do the same procedures that a larger business does without the same resources. Also, you know, it's challenging to measure what you're doing effective. Are you doing too much? Are you not doing enough? So it's sometimes difficult to allocate resources and energy levels to, I guess, measure if what you're doing is actually, you know, efficient. Within that, the workers, you know, we have to get them on the same page. Are they understanding the importance of you know, a food allergy program? You know, a lot of training, a lot of, you know, repetitive training to employees to make sure that they're still following, you know, the rules and guidance that's been given to them since day one. And then, not to mention the worker turnover rate that's prevalent, you know, today. We find ourselves, you know, investing time and efforts into a worker, only to find out that, you know, a few weeks later or a month later, they're no longer present, and you have to then, you know, start from scratch on a new worker. So that's sometimes challenging. Another challenge is, you know, just the supply chain in general. I mean, we all know how it is right now to get products. Lead times are different, prices are different. You know, couple that with working with suppliers that you trust, that honor their program still. Like, are they still still doing their practices that they said they were doing from day one? If they're changing it, are they letting you know? Right. So there's a trust situation that, you know, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt, but it is challenging. And then within the suppliers, are their ingredients themselves? You know, we don't operate with any PAL labeling. We don't have any main contain in any of our products. We list our allergens as they are, but it becomes problematic when, you know, you're working on a new project and the ingredient that you may need that works really well has a main contain label. And then you look and say, okay, do we have to change our system to be able to have this foreign or new scenario into our food plant? Is it worth doing it? You know, so there's challenges like that happen almost every day. But this guide, I do believe, does kind of help businesses understand how they can better situate themselves. And I'm going to turn it over to May to kind of give some scenarios.
So regarding how helpful the guide is, Allergen Management Guideline is not only a useful package for training employees and developing an allergen control plan for food manufacturer, but also the detailed practical aspects are valuable, such as risk assessment. That is a systemic approach to identify the hazards which associated with allergens, and to identify the necessary control measures for controlling allergen plan. In risk assessment, we are looking at the production steps, control measures, evidence, and data of risk. This will guide us to understand if we need to use PAL or not. As Joe mentioned, we have problem with the sometimes we have problem with the ingredients that has the precautionary allergen labels, that we can get help from the allergen management guidelines. The guideline will tell you when and how to use precautionary label with clearly defined qualitative and quantitative assessment tools. Overall, the Allergen Management Guidelines is an updated and scientific roadmap for food manufacturers to enhance our allergen control plan and therefore our food safety program. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joe and May. We really appreciate your insights. It's always great to hear from the end user, kind of how they feel this could be helpful. Joe and May, I think you raised some interesting questions and challenges. And what I'd like to do now is open up the floor to any questions for any of our panelists. Everyone is available. Everyone has their cameras back on. This is great. So Colleen, I'll turn it over to you because I know you've been collecting some questions as we've been coming in. So happy to address them.
Indeed. Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you, May and Joe, for your really valuable, interesting impressions and inputs and background about your company. And thank you so much, Sylvia and Samuel, for your presentations. Great detail. And they've generated a lot of questions, so I'll just jump in. We have a question asking if the priority allergens are listed in the ingredients list, is it required to put them in contains statement as well? And I'll just open this up to whoever wants to tackle that.
Okay. So this is actually a regulatory question related to the current regulation. And in fact, our current regulation for the declaration of allergens is that you have either or. You don't have to list them twice. You can have the declaration in the list of ingredient or in a contained statement. The only proviso is that if a contained statement is resorted to, then the contained statement cannot be partial, meaning that once you decided, for example, that you wanted to say contains egg, but also you have wheat in your product, then you have to have contains egg and wheat, even though wheat is declared on the list of ingredient. Basically, in other words, this is made in such a way that the consumer, once they start reading the contained statement, they don't have to go back to the list of ingredient to check whether there is a priority allergen. There is one place where priority allergens are listed. If a contained statement is there, it should be that place.
Thank you very much. I have a question. Can we consider jalapeno as an allergy food?
Not according to FAO, WHO criteria, at least, or at least we didn't run, those data against it. But I would say that I haven't seen jalapeno in any priority list But again, in general, again, any food that contains a protein is likely to be an allergen, but that doesn't mean that it is a priority allergen. A priority allergen is from a regulatory standpoint, and that's why you have very clear criteria around it.
Thank you, Samuel. And another viewer asks, how would a small to medium food producer conduct threshold testing? Would this be lab testing required for each product, as well as each time we change supply of raw material? And the comment that this seems like an overwhelming cost and time commitment for perhaps a very small improvement to PAL.
Okay, so I don't know. I mean, I don't want to be taking all the questions. If colleagues want to jump in, I'm happy to pass. But I think actually I'm gonna start perhaps. You know, I think we need to make a distinction between what we call thresholds, first of all, which are essentially these doses that we consider as inducing a potential reaction in people, and essentially levels that you detect as a result of your allergen control practices. So testing needs to happen only for a particular reason. Generally, testing is there in order to verify, validate your sanitation practice, in order to look at the hypothesis of cross-contamination that you have, and you wanna quantify that on. Testing can happen also on your supply, so essentially on your ingredients or your whatever you may source from your suppliers. But generally, these are validation activities, because again, your supplier should be providing you with the assurances vis-a-vis the particular presence or the lack thereof of an allergen, and should essentially be providing you with any type of testing result if testing is required. So again, we're not saying that testing is needed for everything here. You would have to have certain triggers that may actually lead you to use testing as one of the elements in your allergen control practices, and the output of that testing can be used to support this risk assessment. But sometimes you can actually conduct a risk assessment without doing any testing, through simply hypothesis of carryover, etc. So without even doing any testing per se.
Thank you, Samuel. Anyone else want to jump in? Okay,
so I can add something. So we test for verifying that if the cleaning is done perfect or not before we do the allergen-free labels. For example, the eggless, we do the testing that if the environment is good to start. And we do testing every year for our cakes that is allergen free. For example, we make non-dairy eggless raspberry chocolate cake, and we test this cake every year to actually validate that our allergen management is doing good.
Thank you very much.
It's a lab test, actually. The cake is a lab test.
And I'll just throw in a question, because someone was maybe just joining and wanted to clarify and make sure what PAL stands for. I think I can answer that's precautionary allergen labeling. I just wanted to get that out there in case anyone else is wondering as we go along. The next question we have is, did you include details in the guidelines about the efficacy of specific cleaning methods? For example, wet, dry, and if not, why not?
I can go with that one. Yeah, no, we didn't go into specific details of the cleaning procedures. This is very specific to your operation, to the technique. We cannot generalize wet, clean. So there's more specific guidance available out there from other sources, and no, we didn't focus on that.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions, so I'll just jump in. In the slide, this is very specific to, I think Beatrice is part of the presentation. In the slide Beatrice presented, there was a blue colored package with ingredient declaration plus quote unquote contains and quote unquote may contain statements. However, below the section, there was a phrase, quote unquote, made in a peanut-free facility, unquote. Is Food Allergy Canada condoning or supporting this practice of made in a peanut-free facility, including its location on the package?
Thank you, Colleen. Thank you. I think I know the slide. It was just a visual to kind of give a snapshot of a current food label. So it wasn't specifically endorsing one thing over the other. It was just meant for illustrative purposes. However, in terms of information being readily available for consumers in one area. So as you saw an ingredient list, contain statement, and a may contain. And below that, I guess in this particular case, this company also has a free from claim. So having all information regarding allergens or ingredients in one area would be very helpful to consumers. As we know, I'm not going to get into free from too much because we're not focused on that today, but as we know that is also a voluntary statement that can be used if companies choose to go down that route. These particular guidelines are not addressing specifically free from products. That takes an extra level of diligence and vigilance, I guess, to another level, let's say, when it comes to allergen management. So it's not specific to that particular practice. But if a company has information regarding allergens and has it all in one area on the label, that becomes much more helpful. From CFI and Health Canada's perspective, the ingredient list that contains and may contain, if it's used, need to be in one area on the label to give that information. Any free from claims, there's not any specific guidance, but from a consumer perspective, having that also in the purview of that area would be very helpful, so you can get all your information in that space.
Okay, thank you. And details of verification. Excuse me. Do you have any thoughts on the US using PAL thresholds to harmonize allergen labeling? Anyone want to weigh in?
So, okay, so perhaps actually, again, a clarification about the word thresholds, because thresholds are those levels that are used to characterize the hazard. So essentially, whatever dose is eliciting a reaction in what percentage of the population. Now, of course, these are numbers that are being taken or that are being developed and used by regulators in the context of their risk assessments when they are managing incidents. And so far, you are right, there isn't any such harmonization of these doses because they rely on the scientific literature and the way risk assessment groups actually use the scientific literature in order to have the data that they need. Now, what we hope is that with the guidance that was developed by FAO, WHO, and that I alluded to, so essentially the latest reports from these expert consultations that will be examined by Codex in the coming months, we will have a more harmonized set even beyond the US and Canada now at the global level of what thresholds may be looking like such that they can be used in risk assessment, not only by regulators, but also by industry. So the hope is that that list that came up from FAO, WHO will be the harmonized list.
Thank you very much, Samuel. Good points there. And we have a final quick question, and then we're going to wrap things up. Thank you, everyone, for your involvement. It's great. If your ingredients, I think this question alludes to or suggests the kind of complexities that, you know, are on the minds of all these facilities and why these guidelines are needed. If your ingredients state or province, it could be an example, may contain, sorry, let me start that again. If your ingredients label states may contain tree nuts and your facility does not carry any tree nuts, can you state that you are a nut-free facility?
Well, it's again really here an interpretation of the truthfulness of the word nut-free facility. I guess, you know, in this case, it's really an interpretation based on Section 5 of the Food and Drugs Act, and so long that every effort is being made to ensure that tree nuts are not introduced deliberately or otherwise into the facility, then you can maintain your statement of nut-free facility, meaning that that statement can be truthful. So I guess if you are faced with a situation like this, then your due diligence will be to go back to that supplier that has a may contain tree nut, because may contain tree nut doesn't mean contains. It means that there is a potential on the basis of a risk that could not be avoided. And essentially assess with that supplier why they use that statement, whether there is a likelihood for tree nut to be there. And in fact, also take every measure in order to replace. If you know that the likelihood is there, so essentially that statement is there for a particular reason. So it was clarified that it is needed for that ingredient, then I guess your due diligence is really to look at making sure that you replace that ingredient with something else such that you can maintain the truthfulness of a nut-free facility. So it really goes to your action and your due diligence to make sure that a claim that you are making, whether on your product or your facility, is fully supported by the prevention, the control measures that you have been taking.
If I can just add to that, and just if I understood it properly, from a consumer perspective, it would be very difficult to kind of understand a free from claim for tree nuts, for example, and then a may contain on the back as an example. So in a scenario like that, as Dr. Godbois said, if we're able to remove that may contain, that's one thing. But if it's not, simply just not having them in the facility doesn't necessarily create that that confidence in a nut-free environment. So to have a nut-free claim and then a may contain claim on the back that doesn't jive would be very, very confusing for consumers, for sure.
Okay, so perhaps maybe then an addition, Beatrice, because here I meant really about the ingredient stating a may contain and the facility having but that I didn't mean that this information would be reported on the label. If both information are reported on the label, meaning that you have a may contain on the same label as produced in a nut-free facility, that's absolutely, I mean, my interpretation would be that that's contravening to Section 5 of the Act, because this would be misleading to consumers. You cannot have contradictory information on the same label. That's not how I read the question. The question for me was not about the same information on the label. This is really about how to behave on maintaining your claim when you have in your supply something that is stating a may contain in your supply chain, basically. But really, to reiterate, we should not have, and we cannot have, contradicting information on the label vis-a-vis allergens.
Thank you for that clarification. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel, Beatrice. Great answer. And I'm just going to wrap things up here. I just want to remind everyone, if we asked a question and we didn't get to it today, we will relay that to our guests. I think we got to all, if not most if not all. And I want to thank again Martin of the BAC for making this great content possible. I want to encourage you all to please take a moment to visit baking.ca. And there's a link on the webinar page to understand the benefits of joining BAC and to be part of the collective industry voice and help them put on more great content like this today, which has been a wonderful webinar by our guests from Université Laval. Thank you so much, Dr. Samuel Godbois and Dr. Livia Dominguez. I want to thank everyone and remind you that today's webinar will be available to all registrants 24 hours after we complete it, which is now. So watch for that in your inbox. Thank you, Beatrice, Samuel, Sylvia, Martin, Joe, and May for sharing your expertise, your time, and your thoughts. And thank you, everyone out there watching for joining us. We hope the information shared today will help you make wise decisions for your bakery business.